Welcome back to another Crazy Welder video, folks. And today's video I'm going to be focusing on what I'm going to be doing with my video editing computer, specifically what I'm going to be improving in terms of the network speed as far as that's concerned. So what I've got in front of me here is a Mikrotik switch. It is a 10 gigabit switch, which means that I'll be able to run effectively at 10 times the speed that my gigabit connection that's basically all around my room is running at, which means I'll be able to increase the speeds of file transfers of different huge video file sizes, moving my 4K content from my main rig down over onto my video editing rig. What this will also allow me to do as a secondary kind of bonus is I'll be setting up that computer to be essentially like my Steam caching machine, so I'll be able to basically use that to pull down games from that computer really quickly without having to rely on my rather slow internet connection as it stands, because I only have about 250 megs down, which for my area is pretty terrible. My upload speeds aren't really that great either, but that's kind of less of a concern. The bigger concern is actually pulling down games when I need to do video content. And specifically with this kind of setup and me using NVMe drives, which means that I'll no longer be limited by the speeds that the SATA 3 connection offers. I'll essentially be able to move up to a higher tier of speeds, essentially being able to saturate the links on this particular device, thus effectively increasing my speeds across the board. What this also means as well is that I can offload any of the special rendering onto the other computer, but still be able to do all of the actual editing on my main rig, and then essentially finalize the render on the other computer. Again, being able to utilize this connection speed to reduce the latency in terms of looking up the files within Vegas, which again means that I'll be able to have a faster workflow in terms of uploads and just in terms of being able to get editing done quickly without impacting the performance of my main PC in real time, which again means less downtime in terms of doing other projects simultaneously. Now, this particular connection is going to be kind of pricey. This particular switch is about $150, and then for the SFP connectors that go into the NIC, it's about $30 each, so it starts to add up fairly quickly. In addition to that, I will be using a TrendNet 10 gig card. Again, each one of the cards, one in my main PC and in the video render rig, also require these connectors, so that's another $30 on top of that. So when you take a look at it, it's about $240 worth of just these particular connectors to allow me to run LC fiber between them. But at the end of the day, I think that this is a really cheap solution overall in terms of converting to 10 gig. But the main plan and the reason why I actually have the switch is because I want to introduce my third computer in the room into this equation as well, hence why I need the extra links on here to be able to make this work. If, however, you actually wanted to get fast speeds and just do a direct connection between two computers in, say, your room, your office, what have you, you could actually forgo this particular setup and you could just go with a straight Mellanox connection and use direct connect SFP cables, and use the InfiniBand connection, which is really quick, and potentially you could get 40 gigabit connections at a very cheap cost using just a straight link. Now, what is the downside with this is that for the Mellanox cards, you would probably be using older hardware, so older cards, and the issue becomes that there may not be pretty good driver support since Windows has changed quite a bit since those days, and so it may be kind of a headache to set everything up and make sure that it's working correctly. And obviously you'd want to make sure that you're getting the same two cards between the two computers that are going to be communicating with one another, just to make life easier for yourself. But when you look at the fact that a 40 gig cable for a direct connection between Mellanox cards is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 15 bucks, it's pretty dirt cheap in comparison to, say, even one of these LC connectors. Now, nowadays you can find these connectors for, fairly cheap costs here and there, but there's no real guarantee that they're necessarily going to play nice with the hardware you have. You'll really want to double check that that actually works for you and your specific configuration. But with that said, you could be looking at $60 per each Mellanox card, so 120 bucks. plus the direct connect cable to go between them for about $15 or $20. Again, all of that is relatively inexpensive. So 120 plus another 20 bucks, $140, which is less than the cost of this switch, and you can have yourself a 40 gig connection in your house. And I'll link a tutorial in the description below to set all of this up. The original tutorial was actually found by Linus, I believe, online when he did sort of a cost analysis of different network equipment that you could run through your house, and that was one of the best methods they could come up with at the time. Now obviously you can go for newer Mellanox hardware as well, but I believe that the costs are just not really justified for a home environment unless you really have money to blow, as the more recent Mellanox cards are likely going to set you back in the high hundreds, again just for one basically NIC or network interface card. So that's pretty expensive considering the kind of speeds that you get. The reason I'm going with this particular method again is because I don't want to be going with an SFP switch that uses direct connection or direct InfiniBand cables, because those start to add up really quickly. Usually those kind of switches are enterprise grade and they tend to be pretty expensive and rather pricey. I have found some that are sort of in the neighborhood of this particular unit, but again, I just want to avoid the headaches of mucking about with old drivers and all the other problems that come with running older hardware, where there's no guarantee that it's necessarily going to hold up and work as consistently as something just brand new out of the box like this. This is an unmanaged switch, so it's just pretty much plug and play, although you can set up a network interface on it so that you can take a look at additional statistics and metrics should you want to go that route. But with that said, I think for me, in my home office setup, this is perfect. I would honestly kind of recommend also going this route for any of you that are going to look at the higher network speeds within your home network. And again, look at the Mellanox stuff too, just so that you can see a comparison of what makes more sense to you. Because if you're somebody who is dabbling now in 8K content, 12K content, all of that is going to be massively improved for you using a Mellanox connection, 40 gig connection. You're going to have reduced latency. You're going to have high transfer speeds on all of your files because you're able to set bigger chunks. But all of this is also partially limited by your ability to use RDMA. Now, in my case, since I'm only using a 10 gig link, I'm not sure how much faster it will make things, but the benefit of using an RDMA connection, of course, is that you basically cut out the CPU from the equation, which effectively means that you're not having an impact on your other workflows while you're transferring files. It basically runs everything over the NIC, which speeds things up, especially if you have a good network card that you're running things over. But the RDMA is going to be important for you to speed things up significantly, and unfortunately the only way to get that is if you are using a Windows 10 workstation kind of setup, and that means that you have to go out and purchase the key for the workstation itself, but the software is just a simple key add-on into Windows 10. So let's say you're running Windows 10 Home or Windows 10 Pro. Generally speaking, all you really need to do is put in the key and it will perform any sort of switches or upgrades as necessary to get you to a state where you're able to utilize that. Now, that's going to be an additional cost of about $280 depending on where you get the key. So again, you'll have to weigh the pros and cons of whether or not this is something that really is going to be necessary for you. Either way, you're still going to get increased speeds with a setup like this, but if you go for the RDMA kind of setup, then at the end of the day you're getting even faster connections by at least a little bit. Sometimes it can be a huge improvement, again depends on the sort of hardware setup you're going to be using. I will test this using just regular TCP/IP and RDMA setups to see what kind of difference I get. But again, I have fairly slow NVMe SSDs. They only support roughly, I believe, about a gig of transfer speeds. So not the fastest thing, and I'm using Gen 3 NVMe's. So again, if you're on Gen 4 and you have let's say like a 5 gig capable NVMe or faster, then you're going to be able to, again, utilize the higher bandwidth of something like this a lot better, and potentially you'll also be able to benefit from a 40 gig connection if you go with a Mellanox setup in your own home. So this is where, this kind of stuff, again, kind of will have to play to the strengths of your hardware and the sort of setup that you're running, especially if you are somebody who decides to go with a multi NVMe RAID setup where you have multiple cards, and maybe sometimes those cards are, in addition to that, basically linked in such a way that you are essentially doubling the speed of the single NVMe. Then again, you will want to look at something that's a little bit faster potentially than this 10 gig solution that I'm running here. But as I said before, everything is highly dependent on the sort of hardware you're using. For my needs, this is plenty perfect. I will be using a 4 gig NVMe in my main computer, and I'll have 4 separate 1 gig NVMe's in my editing rig. And so I'll be able to basically just link files from one to another really quickly without having to be bottlenecked by SATA, again, as I mentioned earlier in this video. So hopefully I'll have another video for you guys actually covering the full setup on this pretty soon, and I'll be able to do some benchmarking and just see how quickly it performs. Again, I'll try doing this using basically RDMA and just regular TCP/IP connections to see whether or not there's any performance benefit using the sort of lower end hardware that I have to shuttle files back and forth. And the other part I'm going to try is I'm going to try using some sort of robocopy or teracopy type software where I'll basically be able to run multi-threaded as opposed to single-threaded, which is what Windows File, basically Explorer and File Manager does, because Windows File Copy is fairly slow for these kinds of things, but we'll see. I'll try and do those back to back so that we can really compare and contrast and see what actually makes sense for what kind of setup. But I think, again, in terms of cost, this is not a bad way to go. Again, not enterprise grade by any means, but it doesn't need to be when all you're really doing is just shuttling a couple of files in between a couple of machines on your home network. At some point I'll have another computer connected to that as well, so that I'll be able to send games onto that too. Again, just using basically a Steam server locally to be able to pull games down from. So again, guys, I'm going to do another video doing basically a detailed look at the full setup once this has been completed. Hoping to get pretty good performance out of this. It's certainly going to be a heck of a lot faster than just using the regular gig connection that I have between all of my machines already. But something else to keep in mind is that if you have a newer motherboard, you may already have a 10 gig NIC on board just built into the motherboard, so you may not necessarily even need to bother with something like this. You will just need to make sure that you pick up a cable that's capable of those 10 gig speeds. So you're going to be looking at the latest Cat 6 cables and potentially Cat 7 or Cat 8, depending on, again, availability in your area to be able to support that. And of course, depending on the length of the run that you need to send the cables to get from one machine to another. But again, potentially, you may not even need a solution like this if your motherboard is new enough that it has the newer hardware to the point where the only thing you might really need is just having a 10 gig cable going between two machines, or potentially you might just be looking at getting yourself another one of these 10 gig switches. But again, those are in the $140, $160 range that just don't have the SFP connectors. They just have the newer 10 gig capable Ethernet jacks on board, which again just simplifies it for you, because then all you need to do is get the newer Ethernet cables that are capable of those speeds, that bandwidth, and you don't have to bother getting yourself special LC terminated connectors to go in addition to the switch and the networking cards, because you will be able to forego the networking cards completely. Now, I don't have any of that in my system. I still have all Gen 3 PCIe and just old gigabit links. Not even a 2 gig link is supported on my motherboard as it stands. But again, this is going to be highly hardware dependent on basically on what you have in your current machine. and amongst the other machines in your setup. Now, if you do have all requirements met for 10 gig on all the motherboards in your computers that you're using, again, this won't be a good solution for you because, as I mentioned before, you can just run cables and it'll be a lot cheaper that way. But stick around until the next video where I do some benchmarking on this and get it all set up and running, and hopefully we'll see some good performance out of this setup.